The sun in Phoenix has a way of sneaking up on you. One moment it's gentle, warm against your skin like a soft blanket, and the next it's pressing down, heavy and relentless, making the air shimmer in that strange, almost magical way heat does. I sat by the small kitchen window, staring out at the cracked driveway, the light bouncing off the asphalt like it was trying to burn a hole straight through it. My morning coffee had long gone cold, forgotten between bills and budget spreadsheets sprawled across the table like some chaotic puzzle I couldn't stop picking at. It wasn't the kind of life I had imagined for myself. Not exactly bad, just small. Predictable. My days blurred together, balancing company accounts by 9, lunch at my desk by noon, back home before the sun gave up for the day. And yet, somehow, I kept telling myself it was enough. That being dependable meant something. That someone had to be the responsible one. And in my family? That someone was me. Always me. I could hear the soft thud of running feet upstairs. Emma's morning routine was in full swing, no doubt. She was everything I wasn't: brilliant, magnetic, a force of nature with that easy smile and sharp determination. My baby sister was the star everyone gravitated toward, the one with endless potential, and I was the foundation she stood on. The one who always made sure she had what she needed: rides to practice, new cleats when her old ones wore thin, tuition for those extra training camps because, God forbid, she be anything less than perfect for her next big game. It wasn't that I resented her. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The front door creaked open, and the familiar sound of Mom's voice drifted in from the hallway. "Rachel, did you remember to pick up those groceries I asked about?" No hello. No good morning. Just another thing to add to the never-ending list. Yeah, I called back, trying to keep the frustration from curling around the edges of my words. "They're in the fridge." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps retreating. "No thank you." Of course not. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the mess of numbers on my screen. This trip to Yellowstone, it was supposed to change things. A surprise for Mom's birthday. A real vacation, all of us together, something simple and pure and, maybe, just maybe, a way for them to see me as something more than the background noise in their busy, important lives. I'd been saving for months, cutting corners, saying no to little indulgences like a new pair of shoes or that weekend getaway with friends I hadn't seen in far too long. Every dollar tucked away wasn't just money, it was hope. A shot at making us feel like a family again. I imagined it so clearly sometimes it hurt: Dad grilling by the lake, Emma laughing with her head thrown back, Mom relaxing without the tight pinch of stress etched into her forehead. And me, not just being there, but belonging there. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that image settle over me like a warm blanket. I needed this to work. Not just for them, but for me. The screen of my phone lit up beside me with a new notification, an automated message from my bank confirming my latest deposit into the vacation fund. I stared at it longer than necessary, feeling a strange mixture of pride and exhaustion. Almost enough. Just a little more, and this dream would be real. "Rachel." Emma's voice called down from upstairs, breaking the quiet. "Can you give me a ride later? I've got practice, and I need to be there early." Of course she did. "Yeah, I'll take you," I answered automatically, already calculating how to shuffle my work schedule to make it happen. Because that's what I did. I made it happen, for all of them. But sitting there, surrounded by receipts and bank statements, with that burning Arizona sun pressing against the windows like it was trying to remind me just how small my little world was, something inside me flickered. It wasn't anger, not yet. Just the smallest, sharpest edge of something I couldn't name. Maybe it was just tiredness. Maybe it was the first crack in a foundation I thought was solid. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny shift, that quiet, nagging thought, was going to change everything. There's something about hope that feels both terrifying and fragile, like trying to carry a glass of water filled right to the brim. One wrong step, one shaky breath, and it spills everywhere, leaving you standing there with wet hands and nothing to show for it. That's exactly how it felt when I told them about the trip. I had played the moment over in my head so many times it felt rehearsed, like I was staging a scene from a movie that was supposed to end with hugs and maybe a few happy tears. I pictured us sitting around the table, Mom, Dad, Emma, and I would pull out the folder with all the printed bookings, the photos of Yellowstone's wide, endless skies, the cabins I had spent hours comparing online, trying to find something affordable but still nice enough to feel like a real vacation. I imagined their faces lighting up with surprise, like maybe, for once, they'd see me not as someone who just kept things running in the background, but as someone who could give them something meaningful. And for a second, just one brief, shining second, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, it was going to work. I waited until dinner, thinking it would be the perfect time. Dad was already at the table, flipping through his phone with that distant look he always wore when work was still on his mind. Mom was stirring something on the stove, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen, and Emma sat across from me, absently scrolling through her own phone, earbuds jammed in like the rest of us didn't exist. "Hey," I started, trying to keep my voice casual but steady, like this wasn't the biggest moment of my entire week. "I've been working on something, kind of special. For all of us." No response. Typical. I cleared my throat, a little louder this time. "It's for Mom's birthday, actually." I thought, well, I saved up, and I booked us a trip. To Yellowstone. A whole week together. Just us. No practices, no work calls, no distractions. Just family. That finally got their attention. Mom turned away from the stove, her brows lifted in mild surprise. "Yellowstone?" "Yeah," I said, a little breathless now, the excitement bubbling up again despite the nerves. "I thought it'd be perfect. You always talked about going there, remember? And we've never done a proper family trip, not in years. I just thought, maybe it was time." For a moment, the silence felt hopeful, like everyone was processing the idea and realizing how much it meant. And then she said it. "Oh, Rachel, that's so thoughtful." "Really, it is." Her voice had that soft, polite edge that made my stomach twist. But maybe it would be better if Emma went instead. You know, before her championship. It might be good for her to relax, clear her head. She's been working so hard. The words didn't land all at once. They sank in slow, like cold water seeping into my clothes after falling into a pool. I blinked at her, trying to process what she was actually saying. "But I planned it for all of us," I said, my voice thinner now, stretched tight. "It's supposed to be a family trip. Not just for Emma." Dad finally looked up from his phone, offering nothing more than a shrug. "You know how important her training is right now. A break could really help her focus." "And Emma?" She didn't even flinch. Just kept scrolling, barely even registering that this was supposed to be my moment. "Yeah, it makes sense. I could really use the time off," she mumbled, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I stared at them, heart pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else for a second. All the early mornings, the late nights, every hour spent balancing budgets, skipping little joys just to save a few more dollars, it all collapsed in on itself in that moment, like a house of cards flicked over by a careless hand. They didn't get it. No, worse than that, they didn't care. I swallowed hard, pushing the hurt back where they couldn't see it, burying it deep like I always did. "Right. Of course. That makes sense," I heard myself say, even though every part of me was screaming at how wrong it felt. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I couldn't taste the food, couldn't follow the conversation. My head was somewhere else entirely, already pulling away, already shutting down. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the glow of the stove light casting long, lonely shadows across the floor. I stared at the pile of papers in front of me, confirmations, itineraries, little notes I had scribbled down about things I thought they might enjoy. Hot springs, wildlife tours, hikes with views so breathtaking they made you forget how small you really were. I gathered every last one of those papers, folded them carefully back into the envelope, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk. And just like that, something inside me, something small but vital, snapped. I didn't cry. Not that night. Not even a little. But that was the moment I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Not for them. Not anymore. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after disappointment, thicker than the usual quiet, heavier than sadness. It's the kind of silence that doesn't just fill the room, it fills you. That's what the next few days felt like. I went through the motions, work, meals, errands, but everything felt muted, like I was watching my own life through glass. The trip was off. I told myself that over and over again, like maybe, if I repeated it enough, it would stop hurting. The money I'd saved, every carefully planned detail, every hopeful little moment spent imagining how it would feel to finally do something that mattered, it was all pointless now. Just scraps of effort no one wanted, no one noticed. The worst part? No one in the house even seemed to realize what they had done. Mom kept going on with her usual routine, laundry, cooking, small talk about the weather, like nothing had happened. Dad barely looked up from his phone, and Emma? She floated around like she always did, completely unaware of the wreckage she left behind with her careless acceptance. I thought I could let it go. I really did. I thought I could swallow it down, like I always had, and just keep being the dependable one. The good daughter. But every time I heard Emma talking about her championship or saw Mom smiling proudly at her, something inside me twisted a little tighter. And then, on a Thursday evening, standing in the middle of my too-quiet bedroom, I opened that drawer, the one where I had stuffed away every piece of that ruined dream, and something inside me finally snapped for good. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just started undoing it. I grabbed my laptop, logged into every booking site, and began the cold, mechanical process of canceling everything. The cabin reservation, gone. The wildlife tour, refunded. The savings account I had carefully built over months. I transferred every last cent back into my regular account. The whole thing was over in less than an hour, and when it was done, I just sat there, staring at the empty confirmation emails in my inbox. There was no relief. No sense of control or power. Just this dull, aching emptiness. And then I found it. Tucked between two old notebooks in the back of my desk drawer was something I hadn't seen in years, a crumpled piece of paper, folded so many times the edges were soft and worn. I opened it without even thinking, and there it was, my old wish list. I must have written it when I was 16, maybe younger, back when life felt big and wide and possible. The handwriting was messy, slanted from rushing through dreams too fast to worry about neatness. See the northern lights. Learn how to paint something beautiful. Hike through a real forest. Travel somewhere completely alone, just me and the road. I stared at that last one for a long time, the words blurring just a little as the weight of everything settled on me. What the hell was I still waiting for? I'd spent years putting everyone else first. Every decision, every sacrifice, it had all been about making things easier for them. And what had it gotten me? A life built around other people's needs, with my own quietly packed away, forgotten in the back of some dusty drawer. No more. That night, while the house was asleep, I pulled out my phone and started searching for flights. A sudden, reckless determination sparked in my chest, a fire I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I didn't overthink it. I didn't make a plan or compare prices for hours like I usually did. I just booked the damn ticket. Anchorage, Alaska. A week from today. It didn't feel real until the confirmation email landed in my inbox. My hands shook when I read it. This wasn't like canceling a vacation. This wasn't about anyone else. This was mine. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the fan above me like background noise to every racing thought in my head. Fear and excitement tangled together in a messy knot inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't doing something to make anyone else happy. I was leaving. I was finally doing something just for me. And maybe that was enough. There's a moment, right after the plane touches down, when everything feels eerily quiet, like the whole world holds its breath just for a second. That's how it felt stepping off the plane in Anchorage, the cold biting at my skin the second the airport doors slid open. The air was sharp and clean in a way Phoenix air never could be, like every breath scraped out something heavy from inside me. I stood there for a moment, just breathing it in, frosty, clear, like I was finally somewhere new, somewhere untouched by the weight of everything I'd left behind. The cold was the first thing that hit me, real and sudden and alive. My fingers stiffened around the handle of my suitcase as I hauled it through the snow-dusted parking lot toward a rental car that looked way too small to handle anything the state could throw at me. But it didn't matter. For the first time in years, I was entirely alone, no one to ask where I was going, no one waiting for me to show up on time or make sure someone else had what they needed. Just me. Driving out of the city felt like shedding layers I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. The road stretched long and empty ahead of me, lined with snow-heavy trees and mountains that loomed in the distance, massive and still, like old gods just sitting there, watching. Every mile I drove, the quiet grew deeper, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt free. Like I had finally stepped off the hamster wheel I'd been running on for years. The little cabin I rented was tucked away near a frozen lake, small, simple, but warm enough. There was a wood stove in the corner and thick blankets folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Nothing fancy, just enough space for me and the silence I was starting to realize I needed more than anything else. The first evening, I sat on the porch wrapped in layers of sweaters, clutching a mug of cheap coffee that tasted better than anything I'd had in months just because of how peaceful everything was. The sky stretched out wide above me, pink and gold melting into endless blue as the sun slipped behind the trees. It wasn't the northern lights, not yet, but it was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. The stillness gave me too much time to think. About the trip I had planned for my family, the one they didn't want. About the years I'd spent being the safety net, the steady one, the background character in my own life. And for the first time, I let myself feel angry about it. Not loud, explosive anger, just a slow, simmering realization of how much of myself I'd handed over without asking for anything back. I didn't have to be that person anymore. The next morning, I wandered into the nearest small town, a cozy little place with a diner that smelled like fresh waffles and wood smoke. I sat at the counter, watching locals shuffle in, bundled in thick jackets and knit hats, their cheeks pink from the cold. No one knew me here. No one expected anything from me. It felt weirdly good. That's where I met Maggie. She was the kind of person who could slide into a stranger's life like she belonged there, bright eyes, quick smile, and a voice that carried warmth like sunshine in winter. She noticed my awkward, touristy energy right away. "First time in Alaska?" she asked, sliding onto the stool next to me like we'd known each other for years. "Is it that obvious?" I laughed, glancing down at my new winter coat and the laminated map I hadn't meant to pull out but did anyway. "Only a little. You've got that wide-eyed look. People come here thinking they're gonna find something." She sipped her coffee, eyeing me thoughtfully. "What about you? Looking for something?" I hesitated, the answer sitting heavy on my tongue. "Yeah," I wanted to say. "I'm looking for myself, or whatever's left of me after all the years I spent trying to be enough for everyone else." Instead, I just said, "The Northern Lights." Maggie smiled. "Good choice. They don't always show up when you want them to, though." I nodded, thinking how fitting that sounded, chasing something beautiful that might never appear. Story of my life. The days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm after that. I explored hiking trails dusted with snow, stood by frozen rivers that cut through valleys like veins of glass, and felt something in me begin to shift. I didn't have to rush, didn't have to answer to anyone. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I didn't know I'd lost. One night, I drove out far from the cabin, following a dirt road that twisted through tall pines, stopping at a clearing Maggie had told me about. The sky was impossibly clear, stars scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring up, waiting. Nothing. No shimmering lights, no grand display of nature's magic. But for the first time, I didn't feel disappointed. I realized that maybe it wasn't just about seeing the lights, it was about being there, in that stillness, breathing in the cold air that made my lungs feel sharp and alive. Maybe it was about learning that the journey itself was enough. Maybe, for once, it didn't matter whether I got exactly what I wanted. What mattered was that I had finally given myself permission to want anything at all. And that, standing there alone in the freezing dark, felt like the beginning of something real. It happened on a night when I wasn't even expecting it, because that's how life seems to work. You wait and wait for something to happen, obsess over it, plan for it, try to force it into reality, and then, just when you stop chasing it so hard, it sneaks up on you. Quiet, sudden, and so beautiful it doesn't feel real. That night was colder than the others. The kind of cold that cuts straight through layers of fabric and burrows into your bones, leaving you wide awake even when the world around you is fast asleep. I wasn't even planning to go out, honestly. I was tired, bone-deep tired, the kind that isn't just about sleep but about carrying too much for too long. But something inside me, maybe stubborn hope, maybe just restlessness, told me to try one more time. I drove out to the same clearing Maggie had mentioned, the one I had already visited so many times it felt like familiar ground now. The road was slick, the tires humming quietly against packed snow as I crept along the winding path through the trees. There was no promise of anything magical that night, no reason to believe this time would be different. Just me, the dark road, and a feeling in my chest that I couldn't quite name. I parked the car, killed the engine, and stepped out into silence so complete it made my ears ring. The sky was clear again, so clear it almost felt fake. Stars stretched endlessly, scattered like broken glass across a black canvas. I stood there, hands shoved deep in my pockets, breath curling out in front of me in small, visible puffs. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of my eyes, a faint, pale smudge stretching across the sky, so soft and subtle it could have been mistaken for a cloud. But then it grew, slowly, lazily unfurling like some great curtain being pulled across the heavens. A ripple of green shimmered at the edges, glowing just enough to make my breath catch. The Northern Lights. I just stood there, frozen, too afraid to blink in case the moment slipped away before I had the chance to really see it. The colors shifted, green bleeding into hints of purple and blue, moving so softly it felt like the sky itself was breathing. There was no sound, no grand soundtrack to make the moment feel dramatic. Just the quiet hum of the universe doing what it had always done, whether anyone was watching or not. And then the strangest thing happened. I started crying. Not the loud, messy sobs that come with heartbreak or frustration, but something quieter, more private. Tears just slipped down my cheeks without permission, not from sadness but from something deeper, relief, maybe. Or realization. Because in that moment, standing alone beneath a sky painted with light, I finally understood something that had been clawing at me for months, maybe years. I wasn't broken. I wasn't a background character in someone else's story. I wasn't just the dependable sister or the responsible daughter who quietly made everything work without asking for anything in return. I was enough. Just me, standing there, breathing, living, existing in a moment that didn't belong to anyone else. All those years of trying to earn love, trying to prove my worth by being useful or quiet or selfless, it suddenly felt so small compared to the vastness above me. I didn't need to sacrifice pieces of myself to be worthy of care. I didn't need to shrink so someone else could shine. The lights danced above me for what felt like hours, though maybe it was only minutes. Time didn't seem to matter much out there. It was just me and the sky and this overwhelming sense of finally being seen, not by anyone else, but by myself. When the lights finally faded, I stayed for a little while longer, sitting on the cold hood of the car, staring at the stars as the night settled back into its usual silence. My cheeks were cold from the tears, but I didn't feel sad. I felt free. On the drive back to the cabin, I didn't think about home or my family or all the ways I had been left behind. I didn't think about what came next or whether they were missing me yet. All I could think about was this new, unfamiliar lightness in my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from something or trying to prove myself. I was just moving forward, on my own terms. And that, I realized, was more powerful than anything I'd ever given myself credit for. Coming home felt different this time, not like I was stepping back into a life I had left on pause, but like I was walking into something entirely new, something I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. The air in Phoenix was dry and heavy in that familiar way, the sun pressing down like it always had, but I didn't feel the same weight I used to carry with me through those doors. It was like I had left something behind in Alaska, something I didn't need to bring back. The house was just as I remembered. Nothing had changed, not really. The same faded welcome mat, the same creak of the front door as I pushed it open, the faint smell of laundry detergent and whatever candle Mom had been burning last week. The familiarity of it all should have been comforting, but instead, it felt distant, like slipping into an old sweater that didn't quite fit anymore. Mom was the first to notice me standing there, suitcase in hand, looking at the walls like they belonged to someone else's life. She blinked, surprised, maybe because she didn't expect me back so soon, or maybe because, for once, I didn't announce my return with an offer to help carry groceries or start dinner. "Rachel," she said, voice soft with that cautious warmth she always used when she wasn't sure what to expect from me. "You're home early." I nodded, setting my suitcase down without looking at her. "Yeah. I figured it was time." She hovered in the doorway like she didn't quite know what to say, like maybe she was just now realizing that something had shifted. That maybe the version of me who had left wasn't the one standing in front of her anymore. Dad was in the living room, pretending not to listen, eyes flickering toward the TV but not really watching. And Emma was upstairs, probably too busy with her own life to notice I was even back yet. I didn't feel angry about it anymore. Just numb. Like it didn't matter if they noticed or not. I didn't stay long. I didn't unpack or settle in like I used to. Instead, I left the house the next morning, found a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, but it was mine. It had these big windows that let in too much sun and a little balcony where I could sit and drink coffee in the mornings without anyone asking me to do something for them. The first night there, lying in a bed that didn't carry years of obligation with it, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself slowly, awkwardly, building a life that didn't revolve around anyone else's expectations. I started painting, badly at first, just messy swipes of color on cheap canvas, but it didn't matter how good it was. It felt like something that belonged to me, something that didn't need to be useful or perfect. The calls from my family came eventually. First, just a text from Mom, "We miss you. When are you coming over?" I didn't respond right away. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I wasn't ready to step back into that old version of myself, the one who always said yes, who always showed up, even when no one showed up for her. Emma called next. Her voice was light, casual, like nothing had happened. "Hey, just checking in. Heard you're back. Thought we could hang out?" There was a pause, that awkward hesitation that said maybe she was starting to realize things weren't the same. "I mean, if you're not too busy." And maybe, for the first time, she meant it. But I didn't rush to return the call. I needed space, time to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by how much I could give to everyone else. Weeks later, when I finally agreed to meet them for dinner, things felt different. I sat across from my parents and Emma, and for the first time, I wasn't carrying the conversation, wasn't filling every silence with easy words just to keep the peace. I let the quiet sit there, heavy and uncomfortable, until they realized they had to meet me halfway. "I didn't realize how much we took from you," Mom said finally, her voice small in a way I'd never heard before. "You gave us so much, and we just expected it." I nodded, not with forgiveness, but with acknowledgement. "I needed you to notice before it was too late." They didn't apologize, not directly, anyway. But the way they looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in what felt like forever, was enough for now. When I left that evening, I didn't feel like the old Rachel who carried the weight of everyone else's needs. I felt like someone who had finally learned how to let go. Back in my apartment, I hung up the photo I'd taken in Alaska, a blurry, imperfect shot of the northern lights streaking across the sky. It wasn't the kind of picture you'd find in a magazine, but it was mine. A reminder of the moment I stopped waiting for permission to live my own life. And every time I looked at it, I remembered what it felt like to stand alone beneath that vast, endless sky, finally free, finally enough, just as I was. Life doesn't change all at once. It shifts slowly, like the tide creeping in without you noticing, until one day you look up and realize you're standing somewhere entirely new, and you're not even sure when you got there. That's how it felt, living my life after Alaska. Not some grand, dramatic transformation, but small, quiet changes stacking up until I barely recognized the person I used to be. The days settled into their own rhythm, simple but mine. Mornings with a cup of coffee on my little balcony, watching the sun stretch over the city skyline. Afternoons spent at the local community center, where I signed up for a painting class, not because I was good at it, but because it made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, free, messy, unafraid of making mistakes. Evenings were quiet, sometimes spent reading, sometimes just sitting in the stillness, and learning that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the silence weighed on me, when the old guilt crept in, those familiar voices whispering that maybe I should call home more, maybe I should go back to being the person they needed. But then I'd glance at the photo of the northern lights on my wall, that imperfect shot of green and purple streaks dancing across the night sky, and I'd remember what it felt like to stand there, completely on my own, and finally believe I was enough. One afternoon, I got a knock on the door that wasn't expected. I opened it to find Emma standing there, awkward, hands stuffed deep into her jacket pockets like she didn't know what to do with them. She looked different, not in a way you could see right away, but in the way her eyes didn't carry that easy, careless confidence anymore. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey." There was a pause, the kind that used to feel uncomfortable but now just felt like space she had to cross on her own. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't get it before. She shifted her weight, eyes flicking down to the floor. But I think I do now. I nodded, letting the words settle without rushing to fill the silence with forgiveness. It's not about an apology, Emma. It's about changing what comes next. Her eyes met mine again, really met them, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we weren't standing on opposite sides of something anymore. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, stepping aside. "You can." That was the thing about healing. It wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about building something better on top of it, brick by brick, moment by moment. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, things with my family shifted. They didn't magically become perfect. Dad still got distracted by work, and Mom still had a way of making everything about Emma without realizing it, but they started trying. Really trying. And for the first time, I didn't meet them halfway just because it was expected. I let them come to me, and when they did, it felt real. One evening, I found myself back at that same dinner table I had left behind, only this time it wasn't about fixing things or proving my worth. It was just dinner. Simple, imperfect, and enough. Later that night, back in my own space, I stood in front of the photo of the Northern Lights again. It didn't feel like a reminder anymore, it felt like a milestone. Proof that I could break free, stand on my own, and come back stronger, not for them, but for me. And as I turned off the light and climbed into bed, a quiet thought settled over me, not heavy like the old doubts used to be, but light and full of possibility. I wasn't the same Rachel who had left for Alaska. And I didn't need to be. I was finally home, in the truest sense of the word. Not because of a place, or because someone told me I should be, but because I had built it for myself, piece by piece, starting with the moment I finally decided to matter to myself. And that was enough.